lies at the heart of these negotiations is our debt. And everyone now understands that the issue of debt isn't just a Greek problem, it's a European political problem, because the skewed architecture of the Eurozone and the unilateral harsh austerity policies have pushed debt up in all European countries. And in many countries has made the debt unsustainable. And in the first panel, we have the honor of welcoming important guests, distinguished guests from academia and social movements who will be talking about these topics. I'd like to give the floor to Eric Toussaint, a historian and political scientist, who from April 2015, I won't tell you about his CV before that, but since then he's also the political coordinator of the Truth Committee set up in the Greek Parliament in order to examine the issue of Greek public debt. Eric, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup à la...
Thanks very much, and thanks to the GUI NGL for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to come along. I've prepared a statement on alternatives, because the title of this conference makes clear what we're talking about. We're talking about peripheral countries, countries facing the debt crisis, countries that need alternatives. Now let's consider the crisis first of all. I think the crisis we're currently facing in the European Union is a reflection of relations between the centre and the periphery. They're the relations that prevail in the European Union and which are backed up by the nature of Europe, of the European construct. The title of this conference talks or mentions the debt of peripheral countries. But the problem of the European Union is not the periphery. The problem in the European Union is the dominant relation. Centre countries domineer peripheral countries. And of course, add to the mix the class structures and political structures that we have. Basically, European integration is dominated by big capital. It has managed to get down in the European treaties policies that favour it at all costs. And these are imposed at all costs. Big business rules supreme in European texts. So does maximising profits. Labour, in other words, workers and most of the population at large, are required to see a massive loss in their rights and entitlements. We're seeing a massive onslaught against economic and social rights, not to mention civil and political rights. And this is the biggest attack on them since the Second World War, since fascism, since Nazism. Now, of course, a number of peripheral countries have experience military juntas. In Greece, this was experienced between 1967 and 1974. But at European level, this is not something we'd experienced in the Second World War. We hadn't seen a continental strategy which entailed an organised onslaught against civil, political, economic and cultural rights. That's what we're talking about. Now, I mentioned the problem of centre-periphery relations. but it's got to be understood as a key point for understanding the whole situation. I think it's important for us to show to public opinion that the more the debt situation deteriorates in southern countries, the better it is for the strongest countries and for finance. For instance, since the so-called Greek crisis of May 2010, debt costs for Germany and France, or for a country such as Belgium, have gone down pretty drastically. This is linked to this is down to the fact that capital tied up in peripheral countries sought security, but also it's something that can be explained by the European Central Bank's programs. More than a trillion were lent out to banks at a low interest rate in 2011 under the LTRO. And as I pointed out already, for northern or southern European countries, financial costs of debt have gone down very substantially. At one and the same time, for a number of peripheral countries, Greece in particular, in this instance, access to capital markets is pretty much closed. It's not possible. Now let's look back to 2008. In 2008, we saw a widespread banking crisis in Europe. In the strongest countries of the European Union, the crisis hit Germany, the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands. And you'll recall that in 2008, the press wrote that the Spanish banks were protected, that they were sheltered. You can find editorials from the Financial Times in 2008, 2009. There won't be a problem with the Spanish banks. There won't be a run on Spanish banks. In Greece, the bankers, Karamanlis and Papandreou, who took over on the 4th of October 2009, said the same. There's no problem with private banks. The truth of the matter is that in 2008-2009 we had a widespread banking crisis, which of course obviously affected Ireland. It also of course hit Iceland. But this struck at the very heart of the strongest economies. The banking crisis was widespread, and it was most visible in Ireland, in Iceland, in Germany, in Belgium and the UK. And it was also to be seen in countries such as Spain and Greece. However, it hadn't yet burst out in any visible fashion. Now, one reason for how hard-hitting and deep the crisis was for countries such as Spain and Greece, but this also obtains for Eastern European members of the EU, is that private banks in the strongest EU countries recycled liquidity towards peripheral countries. As you'll be aware, the German banks made massive loans to the construction sector in Spain. French and German banks handed out massive loans to Greek banks, to Greek households and to Greek businesses. In Greece, between 2001 and 2009, household debts increased by a factor of 7. That's to say, private debt in households, credit to companies increased fourfold, but the public debt had increased to a tune of 20% between 2001 and 2009. What we saw in 2008 and 2009 was a colossal mountain of private debt in a framework which was beginning to collapse even in the strongest countries in the Eurozone. And as of 2009, 2010, the weak link in the Eurozone, Greece and Spain, were under threat of collapse. There was a risk of a domino effect on French and German banks that were highly exposed in the economies of these countries. I'm saying this because the main point in 2010 was that a private debt crisis, a bank debt crisis, was morphed into a sovereign debt crisis, which then did become a sovereign debt crisis. Following on deliberate policy of socializing bank losses, so the institutions in Europe, together with national governments, made public debt shoot up so as to keep in hand the private bank sector, to prevent it from collapsing. And indeed, as of 2010, we saw the beginnings of a sovereign debt crisis. But this was the product of the kind of solutions applied to the private debt crisis, to the bank crisis. It's really very important to bear this in mind. And this is also a key point of the first phase of an audit carried out for the Commission on the Truth of the Greek Debt, established in April 2015. It was established by the Speaker of the Greek Parliament and backed by the whole Parliament, and it was my great honour to coordinate that Commission's work. One of the conclusions of our audit over the last 3 months is that in Greece in 2010, the situation was not fundamentally difficult. There was not a sovereign debt crisis as such. Yes, it needed cutting down, no doubt about that. But the main point is that it was a banking crisis, a private bank crisis, and the possible effect contagion on French-German crisis was also there. And so the plan rolled out as of 2010 aimed to bail out German and French banks as well as Greek banks. However, it wasn't possible to say to European public opinion, we've got to bail out the bankers, because European public opinion wouldn't have swallowed that. A sort of drama had to be cooked up in public finances to say it's actually public debt that caused all this. It's all down to excessive public expenditure. Therefore, we need a rescue package for Greece to save the Greeks themselves. But as Philippe Legrand, a former advisor to President Barroso of the European Commission at the time, or the Swiss or Brazilian executive directors of the World Bank said, on the 9th May of 2010, at the IMF, we voted a rescue package for Greece, and it was very clearly a package to help out banks in general, but French and German banks in particular. In an internal IMF document, which is now in the public domain, the executive directors from France, Germany and the Netherlands ganged up to convince the Swiss and Brazilian executive directors, also the Argentine, Iranian, Chinese, and Russian executive directors. So these three, the German, Dutch, and French IMF executive directors, committed their banks not to sell Greek debt, Greek bonds. But they lied. The 2010 memorandum gave time to private banks in France and Germany, as well as in the Netherlands, and indeed to Greek banks, to sell Greek securities to others on secondary markets, particularly to Cypriot banks who paid a high price for this in March 2013. And it also allowed the European Central Bank to do this. They bought Greek securities at prices lower than market prices. And they bought Greek debt also from French and German banks to bail them out. This is all crucial information, and it's information we need to respond to, particularly on the left. I'm reaching the end of my presentation, and I'd like to make the following point. If you take stock of what's happened, the European authorities have a huge burden of responsibility. There's to be a referendum on the 5th of July, and that's a democratic action which is deserving of support, and we've got to support it vigorously and enthusiastically. But I think it's time to analyze exactly what's happened. The general idea has been that negotiation would be a way of convincing the European institutions. What has that produced? Wouldn't it have been better from the very outset to threaten rather as a debtor country? In other words, the country would have said to creditors, look, for us, we want to, want to carry out a debt audit as adopted or as stipulated in Regulation 472/2013. In other words, to work out how much we owe. And wouldn't it have been better for Greece to say to creditors, we want to have a conference to have a debt write-off. If you don't agree to this, we will suspend payment. By suspending payment on the basis of principles of international law, wouldn't Greece have been able to twist the arm of creditors and to get them to really negotiate? Greece showed a great deal of goodwill and kept on paying. 7 billion have been paid out since February 2015. And no euro was paid back in any way or flowed back in any way from the credit. These creditors, with the assistance of the media, manage to dominate public opinion in France, Germany, and Belgium. And they say, no, it's Cyprus who's not giving an inch. Actually, it's the creditors who are being inflexible and intransigent. If Greece had suspended payments, of course they'd have said group is intransigent. But now they're saying that even though Greece has paid, if payment had been suspended, wouldn't that have forced creditors to make real concessions on the basis of a solid set of reasons? I think we have to learn some lessons from all of this. full support for the Greek government in convening a referendum with the support of the Greek Parliament. But let's think through what's going to happen in forthcoming months and years. Without tough measures, sovereign actions on the basis of international law, without that, it's not going to be possible to force creditors to make concessions. It's a pretty tough conclusion to have to take on board. It entails risks, but I think it's important nonetheless. This is what should happen. It is entirely justifiable. A couple of 2 points. I'm concluding in a minute. The public authorities in Greece are the majority shareholders in the big banks in Greece, but they have so-called preferential shares, which don't give them voting rights as shareholders. In countries such as Spain or Greece, isn't it time to start saying, well, the public authorities have to exercise their rights as shareholders to protect the population at large. In other words, their preferential shares should be converted into standard shares with voting rights. Furthermore, we need to look at alternatives, and among those, surely we need to look to the creation of a complementary currency. The country can remain in the Eurozone while at the same time creating a complementary currency using electronic means. Ecuador has just done that. It's been around for a year or so, and it's working very well. If you've got questions about this, I'd be happy to answer. Because I think it's an interesting example to look to in countries such as Spain, Portugal, Greece, and other countries. These countries don't have enough euros, but by means of an electronic currency, they can make up for this. It could account for 10, for 15 of the monetary mass in circulation. It would allow the country to make payments, social benefits, for instance, and it would allow those that are paid in this complementary currency to pay public transport, the electricity bill, the water bill, the bus, or to carry out other monetary transactions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eric Toussaint, for your speech. The committee in the Parliament has given itself, I think, another year to finish the work it's doing. And Eric, I think you've promised to think about to analyze the formation of debt before 2010. I think you said that you were going to look into that and see what happened before 2010 and how debt got to 125% without having a proper welfare state and proper education system and healthcare system, because I think you're going to find billions when it comes to defense procurement, squandering of money when organizing the 2004 Olympic Games. I think you're going to unearth huge scandals that also involve huge companies such as Siemens. You will also look at, you also find cases of clientelism and kickbacks. So on behalf of the Greek people, please continue your investigations, not only into what happened after 2010, but what happened before 2010, because the memorandum didn't just fall from the sky. They are the result of a corrupt and clientelist political elite elite that governed Greece for decades and that created these conditions. Thank you very much once again, Eric Toussaint. We really look forward to you wrapping all of this up, and I would now like to give the floor to Michael Hudson, a professor of economics at the University of University of Missouri in Kansas City, and a research associate at the Levy Economic Institute.
The speakers on this panel, I realize we've all written and advocated for many years that public debts should be scaled back, and Steve Keen and I have urged that this means that many private debts also should be scaled back. So if we're all in agreement with that, what is needed to go forward, and what do we really want to come out of this meeting? I think, first of all, we need a declaration of what sovereignty means in legal terms, that sovereign nations should put their own growth ahead of paying foreign creditors, and that no nation should be obliged to polarize and sell off its assets and alter its shape and ownership of wealth and distribution in order to pay debts. Of course, there should be a redistribution of wealth and income, but not to creditors under the current condition, because you will then have further polarization between the 1% and the 99%. I think that when debts reach the level of at which they disturb economic balance, they should be annulled. And another way of saying this is that the volume of debt and its carrying charges should be brought within the ability to pay. Now, for hundreds of years, this has been a basic principle of the private sector and the private sector's definition of a market economy. What the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission insist is that markets should be ended. There should be no market. That is the basic principle of neoliberalism. It is not a support of the market, it is a destruction of market. In America, we have the law of fraudulent conveyance. This law goes back to before the American Revolution, to the New York colonies. And it says that when a creditor, British creditors were coming over and making loans to farmers in New York State, and they would lend a few $100s to be recalled at any point. And before the crop was in, they would demand payment, and they would get the land. And so New York State and other colonies passed a law saying that if a creditor makes a loan to a borrower without knowing how the borrower can repay in the normal course of business, the loan is nullified. This same principle was quoted in the 1980s when there were corporate raiders in the United States with junk bonds. Outsiders would come, borrow high-interest junk bonds by the various firms using a predatory law firm, Skadden Arps, to define junk bonds. They would take over companies. They would go to the workers and say, I'm sorry, we will go declare bankruptcy and we will wipe out your pension funds if you don't repay. Many economic liberals fantasized that workers could somehow be a part of capitalism. Margaret Thatcher called this labor capitalism, picking up General Pinochet's term from Chile that was introduced by the Chicago economists. Labor capitalism means there is a new way of employing workers, not by hiring them, not by paying them low salaries, but by grabbing their pension funds. The University of Chicago pioneered this in Chile, where the pension funds are worked out. In America, there's something called the employee stock ownership program. The employers will pay employees by giving them stock in the companies. 1/2 of all of these ESOPs go bankrupt. A few years ago, a real estate predator, Sam Zell, bought the Chicago Tribune, borrowed the money to buy it, immediately looted the employee stock ownership fund, and paid off the creditors at the employees. So essentially, many companies who were raided in the 80s brought the fraudulent conveyance principle to try to stop all of this. Now, this idea of lending money with the intention to foreclose propose is basically the game that the Troika are playing with Greece. They lent Greece money that the IMF economists of the European section all agreed could not be paid. The IMF in 2001 had lent money to Argentina, and it was very embarrassing. The basic principle of the IMF is that any government can pay any amount of debt if you can only impoverish labor by a sufficient amount. So the whole idea of running economies to pay foreign creditors is basically an anti-labor policy. The idea of hard money goes back to Friedrich Hayek early in the century, and the Austrians expounded this theory explicitly as an anti-labor doctrine. So Greece is told to sell off its infrastructure, its gas rights, even its islands. And a few days ago, the International Monetary Fund said that Greece can pay all of the debts if it privatizes 15 billion euros by 2022, in the next seven years. Well, in 2011, the IMF said Greece cannot pay its debts. The board agreed that it could not pay its debts. But the head of the IMF, unfortunately, is French. And Dominique Strauss-Kahn wanted to run for the presidency of France. And Sarkozy said, well, most Greek debts are owed to the French banks. You can't expect to be elected president of France if you cancel the debts to the Greek banks. And so Sarkozy overruled the IMF board. Meanwhile, the European Council and the European Central Bank said, well, IMF, nobody's paid any attention to you for the last few years. You have no more customers because nobody wants to submit to austerity. You cannot be part of the Troika unless you agree that all the Greek debts can be paid because we have German bankers. And then President Obama and Treasury Secretary Geithner came over to the G8 meetings and met with Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel and said, listen, the American banks do not lend to businesses anymore to create capital, tangible capital, or employ labor. It's become casino capitalism. The American banks had made so many bets, derivatives, gambles, that Greece could repay, that Obama said the American banks will go under with all of their bad bets on Greece. You have to lend Greece the money to pay private bondholders in the banks, or we'll go under, and if we go under, we'll drive you under, because we're American, we can do it. And so they all agreed to make Greece repay the debts. So in almost any legal term, had Greece been a private creditor, had Greece been part of the real marketplace, it would have written down the debts. Because in fact, the market had set Greek debts at about 1/3 of the principal, and many speculators in America made their reputations, made fortunes when Greece actually was lent the money to pay the debts. Not only did Greece pay the debts, but it permitted its elected head, Papandreou, to be replaced by a technocrat appointed by the financial sector, Lucas Papadimoulis, who happened to be the head of the Greek Central Bank in 2001 when Greece joined the euro. And as head of the central bank, Papadimoulis falsified the Greek debt figures by making an off-balance sheet transaction. I hope the translators can get this, an off-balance sheet transaction with Goldman Sachs to conceal the debt that made Goldman Sachs a fortune. This was the man, the professional liar, who was they insisted be appointed in charge of the Greek economy precisely so that he could overrule the democracy. Merkel told Papandreou, you cannot have a referendum. That would, because people would vote no. Now, it's very interesting. What justifies debt? Let's go back. We can go back here to Belgium 500 years ago when the Low Countries were fighting for their freedom against the Habsburg monarchy in Spain. The monarchies of Europe, Spain, England, had defaulted on their debts again and again. And normally, a royal debt would, when the king died, it would be a clean slate. But the Low Countries here did an innovation. They undertook borrowing by the parliament, by the city-states, and all of a sudden the Low Countries were able to raise money in the credit markets to invest in military defense, to overthrow the Habsburgs, because parliamentary democracy could commit the country to pay, whereas autocracies couldn't. And so for a few hundred years, the financial interests of Europe actually supported democracy because that legally bound the country to repay them. The result is that you had, for hundreds of years, democracy. I think what we need to go forward from here is an international forum to measure the ability to pay debts. At what point does debt service become intrusive, and how much do debts need to be written down to the ability to pay? This is what courts in America do all the time when countries go bankrupt. They write down the debts. It was also what happened in 1929 under the Young Plan, when German reparations could obviously not pay, and the Allies, Britain, bankrupted itself by trying to pay the inter-allied debts to America for the World War I debts. The 1929 Young Plan called for the creation of the Bank for International Settlements to undertake how much could Germany afford to pay. John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s outlined the way in which a country could pay by exporting, by other, and Keynes said that it was the obligation of creditors of Germany, the people who held the German reparations debt, to say exactly how Germany could repay its debts. How many exports are we willing to take from you? What are we able to do? Well, in practice, German municipalities were borrowing from New York money. The Reichsbank would convert the dollars into marks for domestic spending. The dollars would be turned over to the central bank that would pay their reparations to England and France as the allies that would pay for the inter-allied debts back to the United States. And there was a circular flow that enabled the illusion of debts to be paid. It's what Yanis Varoufakis calls extend and pretend when it's done in the case of Greece today. Syriza was quite willing to pay the IMF and the central bank, a European central bank, as long as they didn't have to put up a single penny of Greek money. As long as the Troika would lend us enough money not only to pay themselves, but also a little bit of money to pay pensions, they'd go along with it. And then the Troika stopped. So I think that the problem is that not today, after World War II, the Bank for International Settlements became simply a meeting place for commercial banks and central banks. And central banks in America, England, France, Germany are lobbyists for the commercial banks. In other words, they're lobbyists for creditors. And so they have adopted the old Austrian hard money idea. Let's call it junk economics. It's the Chicago School economics. It's the economics that lost in the case of the 1920s in the debate between Keynes, Harold Melton, and others against Bertel Ohlin and Jacques Rueff and the hard money people. The idea they had in the 1920s went back to David Ricardo in the 1820s. And Ricardo developed the junk monetary theory called bullionism that said any country can afford to repay its debts because there's automatically a repayment of creditors. While he was saying that, his two brothers, the Ricardo brothers, made the first major loan to Greece. That bankrupted Greece, that Greece had so much trouble paying after 1823 and 24, when the loan was issued, that it defaulted 4 times. So while the Ricardo brothers were stripping the assets of Greece, David Ricardo in Parliament was saying their debts can never cause a problem, and his theories were completely overthrown by the anti-bullionists at the time. So I think we should realize that commercial banking systems in nearly every country have become perverse, that the commercial banks that control the central banks, that control the Bank for International Settlements, have the same junk economic theory that all debts could be paid. Again, what we need, I think we should take the lead in creating an international institution that should put forth an economic theory of what debts can be paid and what debts cannot be paid, as a prototype for what needs to be created today, very much like what needed to be created in 1929. And the reason we have to create that is that finance has become the modern day mode of warfare. The financial objectives is exactly the same as military warfare. It's to acquire land, raw materials, Greek islands, Greece gas rights, and monopolies, the Greek port rights and the Greek public sector taken off. That's what the creditors want of Greece. They're glad to lend Greece money as long, when Greece cannot pay, as long as they can insist on selling off the public domain. And they've used another branch of junk economics to justify privatization. The theory of privatization is if you load private sector economies down with debt, with high executive salaries, with stock options and payments to the banks, you can somehow lower the prices that you charge the public for goods and services instead of offering at subsidized rates or free by taxing wealth. And so once the whole objective of this is so that countries cannot provide inexpensive health care, inexpensive education, inexpensive communications, inexpensive transportation. So their phone systems will all look like Carlos Slims in Mexico because they've sold them off to privatize to pay the foreign creditors. So the whole idea of paying foreign debts on this term goes against the whole idea of self-determination. Textbooks in America define any political state as having the ability to issue its own money and to determine the terms on which debts can be repaid. And the Eurozone, by putting the central bank and monetary system first, prevents countries from monetizing and spending their debt into the economy. That all economists, not only on this panel but throughout America, are in agreement that Greece should do just what America did. You run more of a budget deficit to revive the economy instead of strangling the economy. But that's not what's done. What is needed in order to do this is a clean slate, not only with its foreign official debts of government, but domestic debts. If you want an example of how a clean slate can work in practice, look at Germany's economic miracle. It was based on the Allied monetary reform of 1947 and 8. All internal debts of Germany were canceled. That's because most of the internal debts were owed to the Nazis. The one exception were employer debts owed to employees. The exact opposite of cutting back pensions, as the central bank is insisting that Greece do today. All the debts were annulled, and Steve Keen and I, each in our own way, have ideas for how to scale back private sector debts as well. What also is needed in order to do this is a tax reform to prevent this kind of debt incurred again. In America, the banks do not lend for industrial capital formation. They don't lend for hiring labor. They lend 80% of bank loans in America, England, and Northern Europe are mortgage debts. They're made against real estate. They're made against the fact that the governments do not tax unearned income, land rent, natural resource rent, especially for the oil and gas industries, mineral rent, and monopolies. The way to prevent this kind of debt problem again, it is not necessary to renationalize the land or private or what has been taken by the kleptocrats and privatizers. You can have an economic rent tax. The system is very much like what America imposed in World War II, the excess profit tax. Everyone from the French physiocrats, Quenet, through Adam Smith, through John Stuart Mill, through the last classical economist, Marx, developed the labor theory of value in order to isolate that element of price that did not have value, to isolate economic rent, to save Europe from the vestiges of feudalism, the aftermath of absentee land ownership, of monopolies created to pay off public bondholders. All of this was the doctrine of the Social Democratic and Labor parties before World War I. Now, of course, we know they've all gone over to the right wing of the spectrum and no longer should be called socialist or social democrats. So what we need is to revive, ironically, the classical economic program, which surprisingly enough, John Stuart Mill called socialism. There was Christian socialism. There was not only Marxist socialism. Almost all of the free market people in the late economists in the late 19th century called themselves socialists because they believed that capitalism was evolving into socialism. And that's what made Marx so radical. It wasn't that Marx opposed capitalism. Marx's principle was that capitalism itself was revolutionary. It was revolutionary in stripping away the feudalism, the vestiges of feudalism. It was revolutionary in driving itself forwards towards socialism. And that is basically why Marx was so hated. So today, when Syriza's leaders, such as Varoufakis, says that he wants to save Europe, what does he want to save Europe from? It's from not having a real central bank. The Central Bank of Europe does not lend to governments to spend money into the economy, to revive them. It only lends to central banks to make predatory loans, to transfer property, to transfer real estate and mortgage lending, to transfer ownership of privatizations and to fund privatizations. This defect was built into the Eurozone and makes Eurozone crippled. The Eurozone was based on the Chicago School junk economic principles that make it junk politics. And that is what makes the Eurozone ultimately unviable, and that is what Tsipras and Varoufakis are having to contend with today. The Eurozone was built in so that governments could not run budget deficits in the way that spend money in the economy. In fact, the entire economy, without a treasury monetizing this debt, the entire economy has to rely on commercial banks for the money it needs to grow as the economy expands. It's a commercial banker's dream, but it also means a permanent depression. That is what the Eurozone means. That is why Donald Rumsfeld, who I'm sure is no friend of anyone here, refers to old Europe contemptuously and says that the Eurozone is a dead zone. And basically, I think that's right. So on a deeper scale, Syriza's leaders are trying to save Europe from the pro-financial, anti-labor ideology that is crippling Europe by not having a real central bank and by limiting budget deficits to 3% of the GDP under the Lisbon Treaty. Obviously, a shrinking economy is going to have fewer tax revenue and deeper government deficits that then the European Central Bank will demand even further privatization. The whole monetary system is set up as a system of foreclosure on the public domain to take over the public sector and raise the charges, the cost of living, the cost of doing business, to make economies that submit to creditor rules even more high-priced, even less able to pay. And that's the real killer. The European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Council tell governments to pay by privatizing, and until Europe looks essentially like Russia looked under the kleptocrats after 1991, when they were told that this was the way to go forward. Not only that, but the Troika told Greece not to sell to the highest bidder. They told Greece, you must not have a market economy if Russia offers to pay for your gas prices more than a European company, then you must not sell to Gazprom. So you have to popularize and make the public aware of the fact that the creditor domination of economy is not a market economy. The free markets, Chicago style, are central planning. The idea of a free market Chicago style and European style is that planning should be shifted from governments to the commercial banks. In America, from Washington to Wall Street. That basically is the Obama administration's principle. So in a way, you could say the current crisis by pushing the economy to the present crisis is an opportunity to somehow revive the economic arguments that stopped a century ago, an opportunity to wipe off debts that can't be paid, an opportunity to make Greece a highly competitive economy, because if it wipes out debts the way Germany did in 1948, you'd be a low-cost economy. In the United States, if you look at the average family budget, up to 43%, the government guarantees mortgages up to 43% of the borrower's income. Again, there is no, the market for mortgages in America is now centrally planned. Banks will not lend mortgages that are not guaranteed by the government. Same in education. Education in America has become centrally planned. Student loans are guaranteed by the government. Banks will not make loans to students unless they're guaranteed by the government. When you look at what the average American wage earner has to pay before they buy food or any goods and services, about 70% of the paycheck off the top is paid for housing, education, banks, and taxes. So there's no way that America or any other country that has to pay the banks a financialized portion of the income can be competitive. No wonder Europe and America are losing to Asia. So I think what you need, what I was hoping Syriza would do, when the banks go under, the European Central Bank pushing the Greek banks under, in a way will push the greatest tool that the oligarchs in Greece have used to take over the rest of the economy. I would hope that Syriza would create a public banking option. I think that all countries should create a public banking option to offer banking services for normal deposits, credit cards and others at the real cost, and that way you'd provide a real market competition with the commercial bank monopoly. Obviously, you want a public option in health care as opposed to what you have in America, a public option in banking, and a public option in nearly all monopolized rent extraction services. That's the only way to prevent the current distorted banking systems of Europe and America and Asia of making money only for what the classical economists called rent extraction, to make banks work in the way the textbooks say they should work, to make productive loans that can be repaid and productive loans for business. In order to do this, you need to create a new organization to define, a new institution to define the ability to pay, what is a normal loan, and empowered to annul debts that are made with the objective of foreclosing on property instead of actually supporting production and economic survival.